Welcome to Her Story, the podcast that brings to life the stories of incredible women throughout history. Each episode uncovers the remarkable lives, achievements, and struggles of women who shaped the world, beyond the textbooks and headlines. Join us as we celebrate their legacies and inspire new generations with tales of courage, resilience, and trailblazing spirit. In today's episode, I am delighted to welcome back Heather R. Darsie to discuss her brand new book, The Judicial Murder of Anne Boleyn. Heather R. Darsie is an independent researcher in the US, specializing in early modern history. She focuses on researching the Holy Roman Empire in England in the early 16th century. She is the author of Anna, Duchess of Cleves, Children of the House of Cleves, and Catherine of Aragon, Spanish Princess. Her primary career is as an attorney, and she runs the website maidenandmanuscripts.com. Let's get into today's episode. Welcome back to the podcast, Heather. How are you?
I'm doing well. It's really nice to be back.
It's a joy to have you back because today we are discussing Anne Boleyn, who is the subject of your new book. But firstly, could you tell us a little bit about you and your background?
Yes, so I have a Bachelor of Arts in German Languages and Literatures. I've also been educated at university level in Spanish and French, and I'm self-taught some Latin, enough to make me dangerous, and a bit of Italian, and I can read to varying degrees, several different languages because I do have that intense language background. And then I have a Juris Doctorate, which is the degree that Americans get to become attorneys. I'm a licensed attorney. I work right now as a prosecutor. I've worked as a defense attorney as well, and kind of done a little bit of everything in the realm of the practice of law. And I am working on my master's degree. I've resumed that, and hopefully I'll be able to conclude it in early modern history. And then my Anne Boleyn book is actually my sixth book. So I have Anna, Duchess of Cleves, I think is the one that everybody knows with the red cover. Children of the House of Cleves, Anna and her siblings, which I think appeals to people who are into Anna or German history or Lutheran history. And then I also have Stuart Spouses, which covers all of the husbands and wives of the Stuart monarchs from the founding of the dynasty up through Prince George of Denmark, who was Queen Anne's husband. And then we had Catherine of Aragon, Spanish princess, I'm Not as Simple as I May Seem, which came out last year. And then because apparently I was overachieving, we also had If Anyone Should Meddle of My Cause, The Judicial Murder of Anne Boleyn came out. And finally, the sixth book is a little tiny novella that I wrote during the pandemic, Diary of a Plague Doctor's Wife. So I've been keeping busy the last few years.
Why did you want to write this book on Anne?
Well, it's kind of the same ideas that I had with Anna of Cleves and Catherine of Aragon. I just wanted to know more about what was going on with them, and I thought for Anne, as I did with Anna of Cleves, that the brief narrative, the overarching narrative, was too simplistic. So we have Anne, Henry and Anne fall in love. Henry moves the bits of heaven and earth that he can control to make Anne his queen, and then very quickly he falls out of love with her, and then he has a jousting accident, bumps his head. She has a miscarriage of what was believed to be a male child, and then he kills her. And that didn't make much sense to me. And I'm not saying that those things didn't happen or that they didn't contribute, because I do believe that they did, but it just seemed too simple. And additionally, I was reading Eric Ives' biography on Anne Boleyn, which, if you are interested at all in Anne Boleyn, you should absolutely read that book. It's an excellent foundational book on Anne Boleyn. But in one point, excuse me, at one point, Ives was talking about how there was this French poet, Nicolas de Bourbon. So I'm kind of mixing my French and my English, American English accents there, so I apologize. But he was talking about how Nicolas de Bourbon had written some poetry about Anne Boleyn, with her being seen as a beacon for the French Protestants. And I read that and I thought, oh no, that's bad, because it was such a time of really intense turmoil. And so I did some digging, and I think what I've wound up with somewhat unwittingly when I was in the process, is a book from the perspective of Henry VIII and perhaps his courtiers about why Anne Boleyn had to die effectively. And I add in Henry VIII's courtiers because although we have these anecdotes from Eustace Chapuis about how Henry might have been feeling about Anne or how he was talking about her, I'm not really certain, and I don't think any of us can be certain of who was instigating her demise more, if it was his advisors and courtiers in Parliament or if it was Henry himself.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head, really. It's hard. It's still we're still debating it today. What killed Anne Boleyn? Who killed Anne Boleyn? What was the pinnacle? What was the defining moment? And I think it's really hard to define one answer because I think there are multiple.
Absolutely. And I hope that with this book, I was able to find some things that made a little bit that helped makes Henry's actions a little more sensible. Not justifiable, but sensible given the context of who he was and the time period.
Yeah, I started to find. I mean, I can't stand Henry VIII, but I find it's not easy to just go, oh, he's a monster. He killed his wife. I think Anne Boleyn couldn't be left alive because she wouldn't stay silent. It never would have been silent.
She, in some ways, from what I've found, and again, bearing in mind that I learned about myself that I was writing the book from Henry VIII's perspective, she did not do herself any favors, unfortunately. And I don't think any of us can know if she was aware that she was putting herself in danger, but ultimately that's what happened.
How do you begin this book? Do you go right from when Anne is born?
Effectively, so the book's broken down into two parts. The first part is a bit of a general overview about Anne Boleyn because I realize that some people who purchase this work, it could be their first book on Anne Boleyn. I do go a bit more into the significance of Anne becoming the Lady Marquess of Pembroke and why Pembroke was such an important step for her, which we can talk about a bit more later. And just explaining what I could see about Henry and Anne's relationship, I think I divert a bit from the common understanding that they had a very romantic relationship. I don't see it that way. I see it as being a bit toxic. I think that from both sides for them. And I also see Anne as being very anxious. Not that she was necessarily an anxious person, but we see this anxiety and this despair increasing throughout the relationship, and particularly during her queenship. And that's not to cast any aspersions on her character, but I don't see how anyone in her position could not feel anxious or those types of feelings. And then in part two, I go through reforms to the English legal system and laws, the English Reformation, how Anne was intertwined with these things, intertwined with English reformers, how the changes in the law during the Tudor period, starting even with Henry VII, impacted Anne. I do go over a lot of her statements that were recorded, and we have to keep in mind that most of them were recorded by Eustace Chapuis, the imperial ambassador to Henry VIII's court, who was not a fan of hers, but some of the things she was saying, even if they were lighthearted, were probably, she probably wasn't helping herself. And then I just go through what was happening internationally. So in Ireland and France and in Germany, which at the time was the main portion of the Holy Roman Empire, that were very frightening and that they all coincided during her queenship in 1534 and into 1535, and how seeing these things might have startled Henry or made him afraid of what Anne was up to and just really, really put her in a bad spot.
If we think about Anne in the 1520s, how did she involve herself politically in English politics?
I don't think that she meant to. We don't really see her becoming terribly politically involved until about 1528 or so. And that's when she gives Henry the obedience of the Christian man to read. And so that to me is her first overt act of becoming involved in English politics. She would have been a tangential figure, or maybe even an object. As much as I hate to say that about another woman, she might have been an object involved in English politics because that is the thing that Henry wanted. That is the thing that spurned on completion of legal reformation and religious reformation within England and caused these huge ruptures. But she didn't seem to start becoming involved until the late 1520s.
You mentioned earlier about how important it was when Anne was made the Marquess of Pembroke. Why is it so important?
Aside from the sheer romantic perspective that Pembroke was important to the Tudor family, it was a palatinate or a territory palatine, and you typically have duchies or counties or marquisates palatine. Another example of this would be Anna of Cleves' family. Anna's actual last name is Vandermark, which means of the mark, from the marches, County Palatine. So in England, there were, I think, approximately six of them originally, but by the time Henry VIII became king, all of them had been alienated, which is a legal term for transferred to the crown. And so he possessed all of them except for Durham, which is what Thomas Wolsey had. So Thomas Wolsey was a prince bishop. He would have had the same powers that Anne Boleyn was granted through being given the Marquisate of Pembroke. But when Henry made Anne the Marquess, Lady Marquess, so not the Marchioness, which is the female term and the subservient term, the courtesy title, if you will, even though I'm probably not using that phrase totally optimally, but the Lady Marquess of Pembroke, he was granting this territory to Anne in her own right. She was realistically only below Henry in power. So with counties, duchies, marquisate, territories, palatine, the people who rule those are effectively more powerful than a prince or a duke, regardless of the title, because of what they're able to do, and they are just below the king. So Anne would have had the ability to mint coins, pass laws, pass judgment within her palatinate territory, and also to raise an army. And the purposes of all of these things were to keep the borderlands secure. And Pembroke borders or is within what we think of as Wales today. So when Henry gave Anne this power, he was effectively making her a prince in some ways. And so when we move forward then into the troubles that occurred later on, specifically during Anne's queenship, whether or not she realized she had these powers, she did. And so if she would have decided to rebel, or if there were people wanting to use her as some sort of figurehead, Anne had a stunning amount of actual power by that point.
With the power that Anne was given, was was she made more dangerous because of that?
I believe that it became that way. And so oftentimes in our lives, and I'm sure Henry VIII's life and Anne Boleyn's life, we do things and they seem like a really, really good idea at the time. And then as circumstances change, as our lives develop, it is suddenly not a good idea. And so realistically, I think that Henry shot himself in the foot with this one by giving Anne that type of power.
Anne becomes queen in 1533. What are some of the things that you believe she did wrong that caused her death in 1536?
So there's a lot of little things. And when we think of Anne, it is so difficult to really know her personality because, like so many people from back then, she did not write down her thoughts or even what was happening in her day to day. So we have glimpses and ideas of what she was like, and she can be a very double-sided person in this way. On the one hand, she's an intelligent woman. She wants to spread or at least discuss religious reform. She was very interested, particularly in the French religious reformers. She was sharing these books with the ladies in her court and the people immediately around her. Was she probably hopeful that some people would become a little more on board with reform in a slightly more intense way than Henry VIII? I think so. But we don't know that she was trying to undermine Henry VIII. We don't know how good of a heart she had, and I'm willing to give her the benefit of the doubt, versus was she conspiring to do anything? Anne's biggest problem as a person was that she did not know when she was in danger and she did not know when to keep quiet, but we can come back to that later. But I think that Anne had a very difficult time transferring from being a mistress and being in control of herself and being able to get away with a lot of things because even though she would have been in some ways a prominent figure at court, she was not the queen. So she was not the example of womanhood for the kingdom, which is, when we really think about it, part of what a queen's supposed to be doing. And then when she became queen, I think that it's reasonable to believe or assume or not discount the idea that she continued on with a lot of those behaviors that she had as a mistress. So, for example, having banned books, and that was probably her biggest issue.
I mean, are there more reasons than obviously banned books are incredibly dangerous, but did she break boundaries in other ways?
She did. So, going back to the books, one of the legal changes that was happening beginning with Henry VII and picking up steam throughout the reigns of the other Tudors was this use of proclamations. And proclamations originally were meant to slightly augment laws or notify the kingdom of, hey, there's this law from 200 years ago. I'm really going to enforce it now. And I just want everyone to be aware that that's what's happening, or maybe to temporarily abate a tax or slightly increase a tax. Sorry, it sounded like I said a different word. Um, but what Henry started doing was using them as ways to go around Parliament to achieve certain things. And this became very common with banning books and the penalties for banned books. There were a few different proclamations passed during Anne's lifetime which outlawed books, and the penalties for possessing these books were extremely serious. And when you read how those proclamations are written, the only person who couldn't be punished by them was Henry VIII. But for example, Obedience of a Christian Man was one of those books that became outlawed, but we know that Anne owned it. And you were given time per the proclamation to turn over these banned books to the proper authorities. But if you didn't, or if you were later found possessing them, the penalties were severe. You could be outlawed, which was a terrifying experience. You basically don't exist anymore from a legal perspective. You could lose all of your property and your titles, or you could even be executed. So Anne was possessing these books. In addition, she did not have the requisite mindfulness in her speech. So this brings us back to Eustace Chapuis, where he recorded a lot of the things that Anne allegedly said. Is he probably being a little, not a little, flagrantly uncomplimentary to her? Yes, but if she said anything anywhere near what he recorded her as saying, even if she was joking, just the fact that Eustace Chapuis, of all people, was able to catch wind of this and record it, that's a big problem. And then when we look at her behavior in the tower, she effectively admitted to committing crimes. And so it's just, I think Anne's biggest problem was she did not have very good self-regulation.
Yeah, I mean, I think Anne doesn't know when to stop or be quiet, as we've both said. She kind she's very spirited and stubborn, but sometimes it's to her detriment.
And I think that that might have been very attractive for her, to Henry, something that's very attractive to Henry about Anne. But then we also have to look at the things that were overtly not her fault. So during her queenship, we had a couple really serious international events happening. In 1530, believe it was October 1534, you have the affair of the placards. And I want everyone to know placard in French means cupboard. In English, a placard is kind of more like a broadsheet or a poster. So it just has this funny word, funny name. But what happened was in October of, I believe it's 1534, these placards, these broadsheets against the monarchy and against religion popped up all over France. And one of them popped up on, um, I believe it was Francis I's bedroom door or a door within his apartments. And it was posted there by what were called sacramentarians. So we have different derogatory terms for religious groups, reformist religious groups. The Germans were known as the Lutherans. In England, they might have been called Lollards. In France, they were called sacramentarians. So that's why I'm using this word. We're going to use the derogatory word of sacramentarians to describe the French religious reformers. But effectively, Francis, who'd been taking a moderate approach to reformed thinking, was now put on notice that there was actual physical danger in his palace. And so he went on a tear, arresting people, having people executed, et cetera, to try and get rid of these sacramentarians who were absolutely terrifying people. And it got to the point where he actually had his sister, Marguerite of Angoulême, Queen of Navarre, called up to Paris because she was implicated in this. And we have to remember that Marguerite was famous for having a court that supported reformist thinking. But that is a very extreme and serious set of circumstances. And after that, we see the relationship between France and England begin to cool. Anne and Marguerite never meet because we cannot have the heretic queens meeting because they would have been a bit that would have been a bit much. But we see Francis's enforcement of anti-sacramentarian laws and books going throughout 1535. And during this period, Anne, who I do believe had a good heart, caught wind that Nicolas de Bourbon, a French poet, was under arrest and being detained for his involvement with these things. And she asked Henry to have him brought to England. So then Anne became known as a beacon for French Protestants because we didn't have Huguenots or Huguenots yet. That's a problem if they're going in and posting placards that are anti-royal family and anti-religion. So that was one of the things that was happening. If you go a bit further east into Germany, Anna of Cleves' family was directly impacted by the Anabaptists, which that's a very dirty word. The Anabaptists took over the Prince-Bishopric of Munster, and Anna's family was married into that ruling family. And Munster is not very far at all from Düsseldorf, which became the primary seat where her brother ruled from, or Cleves, where Anna's father would have ruled from. And the Anabaptists, which you can read about all this, of course, in if anyone should meddle of my cause, you can also read a little bit more of it in Children of the House of Cleves, but they came in, they overthrew Munster, created their own laws, started violently executing people, and just doing all these horrible, grotesque things. And finally, Anna of Cleves' relative was able to cast them out and take back control of the city. But the three primary Anabaptist leaders who still lived when Anna's relative took back control of the city, part of their execution was they were placed in cages were strung from the steeple of the cathedral in Munster, and those cages still exist. You can still go see them. Henry VIII absolutely knew that this was going on. If we look at letters and papers, he was being informed and kept apprised of this, as was Francis I and really, I think, any other European leader. So you have the Anabaptist overthrow or the Anabaptist takeover in Germany at the same time that you have the affair of the placards in France. And then if we go over to Ireland, you have the Kildare Rebellion. And I only go into this a little bit in the book because there are a lot more moving parts to the Kildare Rebellion than what I discuss in there, and I fully acknowledge that. But in some ways, the Kildare Rebellion, which was also partially in 1535, had the veneer of a religious issue. So, one of the very first, if not the first, prominent individuals killed during the Kildare Rebellion was a bishop. So, in Ireland, in France, in Germany, you have these very terrifying, I'm going to use the word terroristic in some instances, events happening. The word terrorist didn't exist until, or terrorism didn't exist until the French Revolution. So they just didn't have that word back then. So I'm going to choose to use that word now in 2026. But so you have these terrorist things happening, or they certainly seem that way to whoever's in charge. And then you have Anne inviting in French religious refugees. You have the Anabaptists that are in England and Henry passing proclamations to kick them out because they're dangerous and violent. And in some ways is regarded as a Lutheran by certain individuals and is flagrantly promoting, yeah, let's have translations of the Bible in English even though they've been outlawed. So I don't know that Anne was as politically savvy as we like to think that she was. She might have been savvy for the English court, but she did not know what was happening internationally because I would like to believe that had she known these things were happening, she would not have acted in the ways that she did.
Yeah, I can see that. I think she was savvy in terms of court politics at the Tudor court because she was brought up in that from the 1520s. But even though she did grow up in France for a time, I don't think she was as internationally savvy once she becomes queen.
I think she would have lost connection as soon as she came back to England because I don't, not to be a bit base, but I don't know that she would have been able to be pen pals with, Francis the First, who was widowed for a period of time, and then he winds up marrying Eleanor von Habsburg, Charles V's sister. They didn't like Anne Boleyn. So I don't know with whom she would have been in contact to kind of keep abreast of what was happening in a direct sense in France.
In the book, towards the end, you discuss Anne in the context of English and international history. Could you tell me how you explored this?
It's really to look at how her behaviors could have been interpreted from that international perspective and why Henry and his advisors would have seen that as a threat or as a danger to England. Regardless of how we feel about Henry as a husband, if you will, his main goal throughout his reign was to keep England safe. And he was very good at that. They were not invaded. There were some incidences and things, but there was not a major war from outside individuals coming into England. We had rebellions and things like that, but Henry's number one priority was to keep England safe. Anne was not safe for England, it would seem, as things went along. Again, she's not obeying laws. Up until her imprisonment, she was actively importing banned books. So we know that her chaplain came back from the Netherlands, from Amsterdam, which famously was a printing center for banned books in English. And he came back with banned books. We don't know which ones, unfortunately, but we know that he arrived after her arrest and was caught with these items that were seized. So Anne was not respecting and was breaking her husband's laws, and they were proclamations, but that is what she was doing. Whether or not she knew that that was a problem, but there could have been gossip on the continent of where these things were going if people ever sorted out where they were going. That's a problem. And you have Anne, who is openly held as being maybe religiously extreme. But Anne didn't have the same securities as someone like Margaret of Angoulême, Queen of Navarre, because when we go back to Anne's childhood and her youth and the women that she was raised around, Margaret of Austria, Mary Tudor, who marries Charles Brandon, Claude of France, Marguerite of Angoulême, Queen of Navarre, all of these women had the protection of being royal in their own right. They were sisters, daughters of noble blood, of royal blood, and Anne was nobody, effectively. She did not have that same type of protection. So she was behaving in ways that I think were reasonable for her, considering who her role models were, but also she did not, I don't know that she understood the significance of her behaviors on an international scale. And that is what could have been what contributed to this fear of Anne and why Henry had to have her be killed.
End of the podcast, I like to ask my guests five fun history questions. So, firstly, since the last time you were on, have you got a new historical pet peeve?
I don't like this. I'm not an art historian. Just gonna throw that out there. I think it's really exciting when we find new artworks or rediscover old artworks, I should say, that give us a better idea of what someone looked like, right? Like there was a Catherine Parr portrait that had been in a private collection that came up recently that was splashed on the internet. And it's wonderful that we got to see that. There was a newly identified portrait of Elizabeth I that was found a few years ago. Lovely that we got to see that. I have the Rosenbach portrait of Anna of Cleves on the cover of Anna Duchess of Cleves, the King's beloved sister. That was lurking in a back hallway in a fabulous museum and research library in Philadelphia. It is really, really spectacular when we can find these things. My pet peeve is everyone all the time trying to do this thing here and here and here and here and here. So there have been some people who've been very, very successful, like Sylvia Barbara Soberton and Owen Emerson. Um, and I believe Kate McCaffrey was involved with Owen Emerson's research, finding out who sitters really are in portraits. We just had that happen with Anne Boleyn. So fantastic work. But I keep seeing portraits that are overtly not somebody and no support. And it's like, oh, this is Anne Boleyn. Oh, this is Anne Boleyn. And it just tugs at people's heartstrings and it's so misleading and just often enough patently wrong. So that is my historical pet peeve right now. I don't know if that really answers the question, but that's where I'm at in my life.
If you could meet any historical figure, who would it be and why?
Zabilla of Cleves. I really, really love Anna. Like she's my girl, but I think that her sister was pretty cool and pretty brave. And I guess my second choice would be Amalia, the younger sister, because she is profoundly sassy.
Have you got a favorite historical building?
I really enjoy going to Hampton Court Palace. And then in the United States, I really like touring the Driehaus Museum in Chicago. So Richard, I think his name is Richard. Richard Driehaus built this fabulous late 19th century home. It was the golden age in Chicago at that time. So it's a multi-story mansion in Chicago, and it's very well furnished with period pieces and other things that might delight those who are interested in 19th century history. So I absolutely recommend it. But that's what that is. So go check it out if you're in Chicago.
If you could live in any historical era, when would it be?
Well, the one I'm in now is pretty great because I'm a woman and I like medical care. But if my femininity and my sex were not an issue and I had access to adequate medical care, I would really like to go on vacation to the 16th century for maybe like a month, just to see what people really, really appreciate, what people were reading, see what our concepts of things were. And I think to be around common people and see how much they really cared about what their king and queen were up to. Because I don't know how much they cared because life was hard back then. But that's what I would like to do is go back to the 16th century and check it out for a little bit.
I was just gonna say, like, everyone, you always see in Chronicles, don't you? Oh, yeah, the people love their king. Did they? Did they
Did
really love him?
did they care? Like, how did the king, I mean, even with Henry VIII's marital excitement, how much did that really impact a farmer in the north of England?
And finally, have you got a favorite historical fact?
I do. My favorite one is that Henry VIII and Anna of Cleves were born on the same day. They were both born on June 28th. So he was born on June 28th of 1491 and Anna was born on June 28th of 1515. And I know you've probably heard the September date. If you're interested in how I came to June 28th of 1515 for Anna's date of birth, check out Anna, Duchess of Cleves, the king's beloved sister. I go through the primary source and everything on that. But so when they were married, Henry was exactly twice Anna's age. He was 48 and she was 24. So I just think it's, I don't know, if things would have turned out better and if Wilhelm wouldn't have messed up their, if Anna's brother Wilhelm wouldn't have messed up the marriage of Henry and Anna with going to war, I just think it's a cute little historical fact that maybe they could have celebrated their birthday together, but they did not.
Yeah, they can have a joint party because they're born on the same day.
Right? No, he sent her to Richmond, maybe for her birthday, who knows? And things are already too late by then, so
Thank you so much for coming back on today and discussing your brand new book.
yeah, thank you for having me. And if anyone wants to get in contact, the easiest way is through my website, maidensandmanuscripts.com. There's a little contact branch there that emails me. Feel free to check it out. If you would like to order a copy of If Anyone Will Meddle of My Cause, The Judicial Murder of Anne Boleyn, the physical book is out in the UK. If you are in the United States or outside of the UK, you can get the Kindle version right now. If you want a physical copy, you can order it from Blackwell's Books, specifically if you're in the United States. I know that they do free shipping to the US, so you can get it that way. Or if you don't mind being patient, the book comes out in late April of 2026 in the US and internationally.
Thank you for listening to her story. If there's a historical woman who inspires you and you'd like to share her story on the podcast, we'd love to hear from you. Get in touch at unholytudor@gmail.com. Until next time, keep celebrating the incredible women who've shaped our world.